Resuming debate, the honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Having a place to call home should not be merely a dream in Canada. It shouldn't be a distant memory from generations past. It must be an achievable reality for all Canadian families. Because Canada cannot reach its full potential until everyone has a safe bed to sleep in and a welcoming place to come home to at the end of the day. I've had the privilege of visiting many communities in Canada, and there is a despair that too many Canadians are feeling, an emptiness that many of our fellow citizens are dealing with as the dream of having a home of their own slips further and further away from their grasp. Canada needs leaders who will turn rhetoric and words into real, tangible action to get shovels in the ground now. The housing situation in Canada is in crisis, and times of crisis require bold action and real leadership. Madam Speaker, I've spoken in this House before about Kim Doughty. She was the catalyst who motivated her husband Claude and myself to get an emergency shelter built in Huntsville, 6 beds of emergency shelter and 10 units of transitional housing. The community rallied to the cause and we got the project built, and we were justly proud of the accomplishment. We also knew it was just one step. There was much more to be done. And so after I was elected as mayor, I met with Kim again and some of her housing colleagues, and she told me some heartbreaking stories about suffering and struggle, most of it in hiding, right in our picturesque Muskoka. What Kim told me that day years ago is the same thing we hear today in our communities all across this country. Housing is more than economics. It's more than shovels and dirt and wood. For too many, it's literally life and death. And if the leaders of all levels of government took up the cause of combating this crisis, we would do more than just make our communities more affordable. We would literally be saving lives. So at the time our council and administration set to work to changing policies, we made land available to developers to build, and so did the community take up the cause. The Table Soup Kitchen was working hard at the time to open a shelter for men in Huntsville. They were very near completion when there was an issue that arose over the fire code and access and entry points. So we weren't quite ready to open it. And in the midst of all of this, there was a young man named Paul who had his struggles, but he was a joyful fellow, well-liked in the community. And he requested to stay in the shelter one night, but he was turned away because they didn't have their occupancy permit yet. So he stayed in his old beat-up Volkswagen van that night. When police later found Paul's van, their investigation concluded that the candle he lit, presumably to create a bit of warmth on that cold November night, had tipped over as he slept. Huntsville lost Paul that night, and our community was devastated. So was I. I received emails from residents shocked and angry, some charging that Paul's blood was on my hands. Paul's father later wrote a letter to our community to thank us for welcoming his son, for making Huntsville the place that Paul called home, quite proudly. He assured us that his death was not anyone's fault, that Paul made his own choices, that no one was to blame. And yet, weren't we? Wasn't I? Just a little? What more could I have done to resolve the occupancy dispute? What mental health supports weren't there that should have been there? Are any of us in leadership in Canada doing enough right now? Tragically, Paul's story is not unique. It is one that is repeated in every corner of this country. On average in Toronto now, 3 homeless people die a week. The vacancy rate for rentals in Canada is 1.9%. That means there's nothing to rent. Rental rates have doubled the last 8 years of this government. Home prices have doubled under the last 8 years of this government. And for the 35-year-old living in their parents' basement, unable to start a family, the entrepreneur thinking of moving to another country, or the company passing off the opportunity to grow in Canada because they simply cannot find a place for their workers to live. The problem is getting worse. It is a crisis. It holds our country back from economic opportunity and prosperity. It holds Canadians back from being able to achieve their dreams. It stops us from building communities. And in many cases, it's life and death. The problem is that we don't have enough supply. Years of bad policy has left our country without enough homes for Canadians. We're not building fast enough to keep up with the rising levels of immigration, and the result is too many of the homes we have today are too expensive for too many of the Canadians that live here. And the solution is we need to get more shovels in the ground and build more homes faster. We must make it easier to build, easier to get permits, easier to source the skilled labor and building materials needed to get the job done. And we must make it harder for the NIMBY activists and politicians who hold development up to stop them from doing that. Unfortunately, what we get from this government is a lot of talk, no real results. We see a minister of housing who attends a lot of announcements, but not a lot of ribbon cuttings or groundbreakings or grand openings. In fact, a few weeks ago, I asked the Minister of Housing if Canada was in fact in a crisis, something his provincial counterparts and economists and housing experts, his own officials, agree. He rambled on about political talking points and spoke about his government increasing their ambition. Madam Speaker, in a crisis, you devote every possible resource to addressing an issue. It means bringing every single part to the table and taking an all-hands-on-deck approach to face the challenge head-on. Not surprisingly, the minister has not done this because he doesn't seem to be aware of the magnitude of the problem. Canadians deserve better than that. They deserve a country where if you work hard, if you play by the rules, then the dream of owning a home will always be in reach. And our country deserves a government that will work as hard to get shovels in the ground as those Canadians who work hard every single day, saving and sacrificing to do their part to build a brighter future for them and their families. Speaker, this crisis is real, and the solutions we put forward must be bold. The old way of doing things simply doesn't work anymore. For years, housing providers from social housing, co-op housing, community groups, market-based developers have found it nearly impossible to access CMHC programs. Their procedures are convoluted. Their decisions often don't even make any sense. And the Auditor General has reported that they're not even entirely sure if what they're doing is having any impact. Well, Madam Speaker, Canadians don't need the Auditor General to tell the truth. The fact of the matter is, it is not working. Just last week, the CMHC raised insurance rates on multi-unit purpose-built rentals. They raised those premiums by almost 200%. This government's out-of-touch housing policies will continue to drive up the rent on the most vulnerable of Canadians and further stall the construction of new units. But there is good news. Conservatives are ready to clean up this government's mess. We're going to get the big government inaction out of the way and ensure that the federal government is no longer a barrier to getting more homes built. We're going to make available a minimum of 15% of underutilized government properties and clear the way for homes of all kinds to be built on land that the government hasn't been using. And while we're at it, we will stand up to the NIMBY activists and cowardly politicians who plague our system, the folks who fight tooth and nail against new homes being built in our communities. Because Conservatives understand that if we are ever going to ensure that the next generation, that new Canadians, that young families have the same opportunities that every person in this House has had, then we cannot allow the NIMBYs and the naysayers and the critics to stand in the way anymore. That is why we are going to tie federal funding on all infrastructure projects for municipalities to how quickly they can clean up their act and get homes built faster. We will require that any major transit project to receive federal funding, that they must have the land around it on that transit ready to go for high-density housing immediately. Let me be clear. Conservatives are loudly and proudly saying yes to building more homes in Canada's backyard. The days of municipal councillors being able to hold up projects and vilify home builders must come to an end. The days of talk and delays and deferrals must be a thing of the past. And come the next federal election, the days of having a Minister of Housing who does not even have the courage to admit that Canada is in a housing crisis, let alone take the actions to fix it, well, Madam Speaker, those days will be done too. As a former mayor, I can tell you that homes don't get built without leaders who have the courage and the fortitude and the conviction to make the tough decisions. Some decisions that aren't popular, Madam Speaker, but must be made. From coast to coast to coast, the housing crisis is claiming lives and shattering dreams. Canadians are living out of trailer parks, taking on crippling levels of debt. Sadly, too many are dying in the streets of our communities, big and small. It is time for bold action and tangible results. And working with all levels of government, with trade unions in the private sector and the community organizations, we will get things building. And I ask every Canadian who has ever dreamed of having a place to call their own, the single mom working relentlessly to build a better future for her children, the entrepreneur thinking of leaving Canada, the new immigrant dreaming of coming to Canada, the young people locked out of the housing market, the parent with those young people still living in their basements, do not lose hope, because we hear you loud and clear, and help is on the way. After the next federal election, the Conservative government will hit the ground running and work on day one to ensure that having a place to call home at the end of the day is not just the privilege of a few, but the reality of every single Canadian from every walk of life. Because a home of your own in this magnificent Canada must no longer be just a dream, it must be a reality. Conservatives will get this country building again, Madam Speaker. Conservatives will bring it home. Thank you.